Hey human, welcome to the Void once more. Come on in. Throughout history, we experience many rigid and authoritarian kings, queens, prime ministers, presidents, and many other authority figures. Those that demand blind obedience, who strongly appeal to emotion to influence those that are willing to listen and to obey. In these instances, people have been told to not question authority. When people do not question authority, at least politically speaking, the doors are wide open for justified violence, justified racism and ethnocentrism, and many other forms of discrimination. Many are told to just go with the flow, support the cause, and all the modern problems that apparently weren't problems before will magically disappear. This happens while their rights, and especially the rights of those deemed undesirable, just fade away behind their backs. Now, the case has been made for those authoritarian figures in all spheres of power before. Many studies have been done on them, and many documentaries and even YouTube videos have been made about them, attempting to explore their line of thinking, so we won't really bother that much with those people. But what about those that quickly support these causes and these leaders without much questioning at all? What exactly can be happening in their minds? Why would a considerable number of everyday people support authoritarian and reactionary politics and reactionary thinking? What goes through the mind of some of these people, openly supporting those that blatantly take away their rights? Or how about take the rights of the other? The other in this case being people from different ethnicities, different religions, different countries or cultures, or from a different social class. Some of the keywords here are different, others, better, and worse. People that are strictly conventional and feel uneasy and even threatened in the presence of others that do not seem to follow social conventions strictly, or those that question the validity of authority, are usually categorized as having an authoritarian personality. Authoritarian personality is a personality type that is hypothetical in nature, and it originates in the works of German psychologist, sociologist, and philosopher Erich Fromm, who is thought of as being the first to coin the term that I mentioned previously. People with a more authoritarian personality tend to be characterized by being extremely obedient and unquestioning of standard social norms, no matter how illogical or even oppressive these can be. These types of personalities can arise due to many different factors. The main factor that is thought of as being the most important one when it comes to the development of an authoritarian personality is a type of parent-child relationship these people have with their parents while growing up. These personalities often develop in households where the relationship of said person with the parents, or at least the most dominant parent, was hierarchical in nature. Households in which hierarchies are very important and encouraged, and where any deviation of the strict social or at least household norms is severely punished, thus creating a conflict between the person's rationale, the person's instincts, and the externally imposed rules, which makes a person adherently strict to these for fear of being judged or acting in a way they shouldn't act, according to their upbringing, whether they realize this consciously or not. In more technical psychological terms, authoritarian personalities are said to have a conflict between their superego, the ego, and the id. These are terms common in psychoanalysis, a branch of psychology pioneered by Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud in the early 20th century. The ego, superego, and the id are theoretical concepts that describe different but interactive agents in a person's psyche. This helps us to understand the activities and interactions of these three parts of the psyche in a person's mental life. Basing ourselves in Freud's structural model of the psychic apparatus, the id is the instinctual component of the personality. This is a part of the psyche that is present since birth in every human. It corresponds to our basic needs, desires, and emotional impulses, and it is not bound by social structures or time. The greatest example of human beings being completely ruled by their id is human toddlers. Toddlers are usually ruled by the id because this is present since birth, regardless of social and family context or other factors. Toddlers are ruled by their physical and emotional immediate needs and have no filter to question whether what they are doing or asking for is correct, or if it is being done at the right time, etc. The ego, on the other hand, works as a mediator to the id, that is, our instinctual passions. It tries to act within a reality principle or framework. It is developed within the first 3 years of a child's life. The ego seeks to please the id's impulses but in a realistic fashion, taking into account the current environment, the current possibilities, and in the long term, bring benefit instead of grief, which is what could have happened had we acted impulsively in a particular situation, that is, to follow the impulses of our id without the filtering of our ego. Now, the superego is heavily influenced by external agents, such as the parents in childhood and later, the real and perceived social rules and norms. It strives for perfection and adherence to our parents' guidance in infancy and childhood, and then later takes on the influence educators, teachers, and mentors had on the person's mind. It is the opposite of the id, seeking to suppress fantasies, desires, and impulses which go against the perceived ideals of our environment. The superego is a part of a person's brain that punishes any deviation from what the person has been taught in the past in their social context while growing up. This is the last component of personality to be developed, according to Freud's theory, around the age of 5. The superego attempts to control the urges of the id and make the ego act morally instead of realistically. No need to mention then that the superego often defines our morality, which isn't always realistic or logical. According to these theories of psychoanalysis, our personality is represented by a struggle in a constant tug-of-war between the superego, the ego, and the id. Authoritarian personalities are said to have, and I quote, a strict superego which controls a weak ego that is unable to cope with the strong impulses of the id. Are you still following? In layman's terms, it means authoritarian people tend to be controlled by external factors based on what they should do or shouldn't do. Whether this makes sense or not, they are controlled by guilt and fear of misbehaving according to the strict logic that they follow without question, and are unable to control the strong impulses coming from their instincts. This usually results in people suffering from constant insecurities when it comes to trusting themselves and their rational thinking, and not just the external imposed morals when judging or making decisions about others they come across or are involved with in everyday life. This creates personalities that often adhere very strictly to conventional norms, often called conventionalism, mostly out of guilt or fear, and not always because it makes rational sense. Rather, they follow what makes moral sense, often without questioning superiors and being submissive to authority, and following the principle of this authority without checking with themselves first, because they often don't really trust themselves, as they are afraid they are not good enough or that they themselves will misbehave if not kept in check by external authority. Because of these insecurities, authoritarian personalities tend to employ certain defense mechanisms. One of the most common is psychological projection. This is when authoritarian people avoid self-referencing themselves and instead placing the blame on the other, thus avoiding the anxiety that is produced by the impulses of their id, that is, their basic instincts. As mentioned before, the other is often those that don't fit with the externally imposed ideals of the superego in an authoritarian person's life experience, especially in their upbringing. This usually means those of different ethnicities, immigrants, homosexuals, or any other type of person that deviates from the norm that they strictly follow. Authoritarian people also have a cynical and negative general view of humanity. They also possess an insatiable need to wield power and be tough. These needs arise due to all the anxieties that people who deviate from conventionalism and certain social norms cause on the authoritarian. At this point, you can probably figure that you might have met people like this in your life. Could be a family member or members, teacher, your boss at work, or pretty much anyone in your life. This type of personality is especially common in older generations that grew up in very strict families, but it is also common in those that grew up in orthodox religious households. This of course doesn't mean these people are less common. Presidential elections and growing tensions around the world in the last 10 years or so will obviously show people like this still exist and are great in numbers. It's also very possible you've identified some of these traits in yourself. Remember that we are all humans and we're not all perfect, but if you identify with most of what has been explained on this video, then make sure that if you are sometimes being authoritarian, check exactly why you are this way, and in which context, and check if it actually makes sense in a particular situation to be like that with others. Chances are that if you are being too oppressive, you might be in the wrong, and this will probably end up being a very inefficient use of your mental and emotional resources that you could otherwise save in order to be more at peace with yourself. And also make sure that when you vote, you're not voting someone only because they appeal to your instinctual emotions without a substantial argument or reason. Check that you aren't being led by your insecurities about other people. I would also like to add in this video that even though I made this video and this channel to inspire critical thinking, that doesn't mean absolutely everything needs to be questioned without a reason or questioning things just because. There are times in our lives where we need to trust certain authority. This includes parents in our childhood and adolescence, and certain authority figures, such as figures in science. But we need to make sure why we support an authority figure of any kind or why we don't. And it's important we make sure those reasons are valid and that they can hold their ground when placed under scrutiny. Questioning authority just because isn't a good reason to question it. It's important certain research and of course thinking is done before doing so. This is especially important in the COVID-19 pandemic and with vaccinations. So please, think critically, inform yourself, take care of yourself and your loved ones, and don't forget to get vaccinated. Oh yeah, and also don't forget to join me in my pretentious quest to outthink everyone else and deconstruct the human condition. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to give a like if you liked the video, and also subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so. I'll be going back into the void of my mind once again to think about the next video. Have a good one.